This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Whenever the topic comes up of whether or not orcs, drow, goblins, and other monstrous ancestries should be evil by default, I always see this response: orcs have to be evil because their god made them that way, or because they formed an allegiance to a god who is evil, or because they were cursed. But I have the sneaking suspicion that it works the other way around. Orcs were evil first, and then a religious justification in world was invented. We know this is true, because orcs in their current form were, let's say, borrowed and adapted from Lord of the Rings, where they are evil by default. I know the concept of orcs in some form predated the Lord of the Rings books, because that's how they made it into D&D and survived the lawsuit from the Tolkien estate. But let's remember, the early version of the game also literally included hobbits and ents. We know where the game creators were influenced. Gygax was not a huge fan of Tolkien, but early D&D players probably had a ton of orc miniatures from their Lord of the Rings war games. We know why the orcs are in the game. And at that time, Gruumsh, the orc god who is the reason orcs are evil, did not exist yet. But I was curious about this, so I did some digging. I wanted to know how orcs were described in the earliest editions, and when Gruumsh was introduced as a justification for orcs being evil by default. We're going to start with the very beginning of this hobby, the release of Chainmail in 1971, which predated Dungeons & Dragons by 3 years. Here's how the entry for that book reads for orcs. Besides reacting to light in the same manner as goblins do, after all, orcs are nothing more than overgrown goblins, orcs are quarrelsome and factious. Factious? It can therefore be assumed that if there are 2 or more units of orcs, they will be from differing bands. If orcs of different kinds approach with a charge move of each other, and they are not meleeed by the enemy, they will attack each other unless a score of 4 or better is rolled on an obedience die. There are giant orcs which fight as armored foot and have a point value of 2.5. And that's it. There's no reference to orcs being evil at all, let alone any reference to Gruumsh. Okay, the next time we see orcs is in the OD&D Monsters and Treasure book in 1974, and here's what it reads. The number of different tribes of orcs can be as varied as desired. Once decided upon, simply generate a random number whenever orcs are encountered, the number generated telling which tribe they belong to, keeping in mind their intertribal hostility. And then there's a section about how many orc sentries would be present in a cave versus a walled city, and a chart of different types of leaders. Then there's some information on if they're found in a wagon train, what kind of orcs would be present. Note that if orcs are encountered in an area which is part of a regular campaign map, their location and tribal affiliation should be recorded, and other orcs located in the same general area will be of the same tribe. And then we get the same info from Chainmail saying orcs react to light in the same way as goblins, although there's no reference to them literally being the same type of creature anymore. And we get the same information about orcs of different tribes attacking each other. It doesn't matter. Okay, we'll keep going. The next release was the Greyhawk packet, and there's no reference to orcs in there at all. Then we get Gods, Demigods, and Heroes in 1976. Now here would be a perfect place for some information about Gruumsh, but he's not in it. But okay, so far everything we've seen has been very much framed through the concept that D&D is a war game, and that doesn't exactly line up with more modern interpretations of the game. But next we get AD&D in 1977, which is what many people essentially consider to be the first edition of the game proper. And here's where some information gets codified. Specifically, here is where we get a default stat block for orcs, including an alignment. Lawful evil. We also get a lot of the same information about orcs, although there's a little bit more detail about their culture, if you want to call it that. Orc tribes are fiercely competitive, and when they meet, it is 75% likely that they will fight each other unless a strong leader, such as a wizard, evil priest, evil lord, with sufficient force behind him is on hand to control the orcs. Being bullies, the stronger will always intimidate and dominate the weaker. If goblins are near, for example, and the orcs are strong enough, they will happily bully them. Orcs dwell in places where sunlight is dim or non-existent, for they hate the light. And then the rest is pretty much mechanics for dark vision, some list of tribes names, and rules for what kind of orcs are in a tribe and in a camp. Then we get some more information about what orcs are like. Orcs are cruel and hate living things in general, but they particularly hate elves and will attack them in preference above other creatures. They take slaves for work, food, and entertainment, torture, etc., but not elves whom they kill immediately. Orcs are accomplished tunnelers and miners. They note new or unusual constructions underground 35% of the time and spot sloping passages 25% of the time. The majority of orcs speak Goblin, Hobgoblin, and Ogre in addition to the languages of orcs and Lawful Evil. For those unfamiliar, in the old days each alignment essentially had its own language you could speak, the same way some modern religions still do services or ceremonies in other languages. Description: Orcs appear particularly disgusting because of their coloration. Brown or brownish green with a bluish sheen highlights their pinkish snouts and ears. Their bristly hair is dark brown or black, sometimes with tan patches. Even their armor tends to be unattractive, dirty, and often a bit rusty. Orcs favor unpleasant colors in general. Their garments are tribal colors, as are shield devices or trim. Typical colors are blood red, rust red, mustard yellow, yellow-green, moss green, greenish purple, and blackish brown. They live for 40 years. Half-orcs. As orcs will breed with anything, there are a number of unsavory mongrels. Hey, also, don't use that word when talking about D&D, it's not okay. With orcish blood, particularly orc goblins, orc hobgoblins, and orc humans. Orcs cannot crossbreed with elves. Half-orcs tend to favor the orcish strain heavily, so such sorts are basically orcs, although they can sometimes, 10% of the time, pass themselves off as true creatures of their other stock. Goblins, hobgoblins, humans, etc. Okay, so we've got our evil orcs. But where's the argument folks keep making? Where's Grumsh? Well, in fairness, he is in the next book we're about to talk about, Deities and Demigods Cyclopedia, which came out 3 years later in 1980. He's lawful evil, naturally. Here's his write-up. The orcs have many gods, but their leader is Grumsh. His name is never spoken by non-shaman orcs, who refer to him as He Who Watches or He Who Never Sleeps. Grumsh's symbol is an unwinking eye, which represents the belief that Grumsh watches each and every orc, and judges him fit or unfit. Grumsh himself has but one large eye in the center of his forehead. He appears as a huge orcish humanoid, wearing gleaming black plate mail, holding a flaming torch in one hand and a great iron spear in the other. Then there's some rules about the spear's stats in combat. The orcs say that Grumsh commands a mighty army of spirit orcs in hell, and these war continuously with a similar army of spirit goblins controlled by MacLeod. The orcs always defeat the goblins, but the goblin spirits always reform to start the battle again. To become a shaman of Grumsh, an orc must pluck out his own eye. The proper worship of Grumsh requires blood in large quantities, preferably blood from a human or demi-human race. Elves are best of all. Orcish shamans range up to the 5th level of ability. Okay, first of all, yes, everything in this description is thunderously badass. As someone who never got these sorts of lurid descriptions in modern books, trust me, I do understand the appeal of orcs are bad because they worship Grumsh, because this makes orcs sound metal as hell. But I hope I've made it clear that Grumsh was not the originator of the idea that orcs were evil. Grumsh was added to help explain orcs being evil. Of course, if you're familiar with the modern version of Grumsh, you might have noticed a few iconic aspects missing. So let's jump to his next appearance in the Unearthed Arcana book in 1985. You're in the weeds. What the hell? What is that? Okay. Anyway, in this book, we get a story that the orc shamans tell. And again, this story rules. In the beginning, all the gods met and drew lots for the parts of the world in which their representative races would dwell. The human gods drew the lot that allowed humans to dwell where they pleased in any environment. The elven gods drew the green forests. The dwarven deities drew the high mountains. The gnomish gods the rocky, sunlit hills. And the halfling gods picked the lot that gave them the fields and meadows. Then the assembled gods turned to the orcish gods and laughed loud and long. All the lots are taken, they said tauntingly. Where will your people dwell, One-Eye? There is no place left. There was silence upon the world, then, as Grumsh One-Eye lifted his great iron spear and stretched it over the world. The shaft blotted the sun over a great part of the lands as he spoke. No, you lie. You have rigged the drawing of the lots, hoping to cheat me and my followers. But One-Eye never sleeps. One-Eye sees all. There is a place for the orcs to dwell. Here, he bellowed, and his spear pierced the mountains, opening mighty rifts and chasms. And here, and the spearhead split the hills and made them shake, and covered them in dust. And here, and the black spear gouged the meadows and made them bare. There, roared He Who Watches triumphantly, and his voice carried to the ends of the world. There is where the orcs shall dwell. There they will survive and multiply and grow stronger, and a day will come when they will cover the world, and they shall slay all of your collected peoples. Orcs shall inherit the world you sought to cheat me of. So that's the reason given why orcs continue to make war on the world, because they think Grumsh was cheated by the other gods. And listen, I'm not exactly about to defend anyone who wants to go to war because they think their leader was cheated out of winning an election because, you know. But trust me, it's pretty easy to see how a story like this could cultivate an environment where the believers would be hostile towards everyone they viewed as elites. These orcs in the story would feel betrayed. They feel they were robbed of their rightful place in the world. We have, at last, a motivation. We also get a story where Corlon, the god of the elves, tried and failed to shoot out Grumsh's one eye, and the orcs take great offense at that. That is why they hate elves above all. We also get the detail that orcs think it's totally fine to go to war with other tribes of orcs because it helps thin out the weak. There are also a bunch of lesser orc gods in this book, and I'm not going to cover them today, but again, these characters are pretty cool. I get the appeal. AD&D's Monster Mythology book from 1992 reiterates some of this, and says that the orcs deny that Grumsh ever lost an eye to Corlon, which is a fun detail. It implies some folks do say that, but as far as I can tell, this is the first time it's ever mentioned in any book. I just think it's a fun bit of world building. You learn a lot about the stories you say aren't true. This book also doubles down on the idea that orc females are weaker than males and valued less in society, and has the quote, "If Grumsh intended females to be the equal of males, he'd have given them bigger muscles." If that's something you believe about the real world, just realize that the creators of this game attributed that ideology to someone who is, canonically, evil. So, maybe have some self-awareness. 1993's Monstrous Manual pretty much reiterates what we've seen so far, although the physical description of orcs leans more toward making them look like goblins. Probably not deliberately. In On Hallowed Ground in 1996, we learn that Grumsh did in fact lose an eye in battle to Corlon, and he is still looking for his missing eye across the cosmos. Again, what a fun detail, I love it. In fact, that could be a terrific plot hook for an orc player. If all the orcs aren't lawful evil, of course. The 3rd edition Monster Manual from the year 2000s gives the orcs more of an upright posture and changes their alignment from lawful evil to chaotic evil, which honestly makes sense given the changes that occurred over time. Originally, orcs were essentially intended to live in their own civilizations or be foot soldiers for evil priests, evil lords, or wizards. Like how they serve Saruman in The Lord of the Rings. But now they've got their own culture where they fiercely fight anyone of any ancestry, especially hating elves, although some books have also added that they hate dwarves because of some beef with their gods as well, and the orcs want to conquer the world out of spite now. It's a lot more chaotic than it is lawful. The Monster Manual for D&D 3.5 in 2003 changes the orc alignment to often chaotic evil, and then 4th edition in 2008 takes them back to chaotic evil with no modifier. Also, this is just a personal note, I'm really glad Grumsh doesn't just have one eye in the center of his forehead anymore. I'm glad one of his eyes was shot out. I thought having one central eye was silly. Anyway, an abbreviated version of Grumsh's lore appears in 4th and 5th edition, including in the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount. His missing eye has shifted, and the prominent eye is now centered in his face like a nightmarish cyclops. No, Matt, what are you doing? Don't put the eye in the middle of the head. Okay, I guess in my games it'll just be off to the side like normal. Fine. Also, I know Matt Mercer probably wasn't the one person who wrote that line. It's all in bad faith. Okay, seriously. What is that? Who is that? What is happening? It's time for some real talk. There's a terrific video from Folding Ideas called The Thermian Argument, where Dan Olson describes exactly what we're talking about here today. His fictional example even uses orcs as the default for a creature who commits horrible violence for some in-world justification. In fact, this video could have just been an extended title card that just said, "Go watch the video about the Thermian argument." And maybe it should have been. My goal with this video was to break down why the argument that orcs are evil because of the gods is bull, because it's so obvious from the source material that the orc god was added later to give some justification for making orcs evil. There's a 3-year gap between orcs receiving the default alignment of lawful evil and the god of the orcs arriving on the scene. And it's another 5 years after that where we finally get some beef between Grumsh and the other gods, which translates into a reason for orcs to be hostile toward just about everyone they encounter in a D&D game. Now, I do think that's interesting. First of all, I enjoy some of this lore. It's cool. Problematic though its intention might be, it is still cool to have an orc god cast a shadow across the world with his spear and split the ground and create places where your players will find orcs. That's cool. Some of the other orc gods are cool. Grumsh's son, Bogtrue, is described as someone who is kind of dense but has a fierce determination and strength. He once slew a tremendous reptilian monster from another world bare-handed and broke all of its legs. He doesn't wear armor and he doesn't use weapons. He's cool. The orc god of death, Utrus the White-Handed, has no mouth, so orcs use the idiom "when White Hand speaks" to mean never. It's their version of when hell freezes over. You could write an awesome high-level adventure around trying to get to Grumsh's missing eye before his followers can find it and use his power. There is stuff to like here, but I wanted to illustrate that using the gods as a defense of having orcs be evil by default is silly. But doesn't that mean I'm meeting this bad faith argument on its terms? Sure, I poked holes in this example, but isn't the better defense against the Thermian argument just to say, it's a work of fiction? The fact that it's internally consistent because the gods made the orcs evil doesn't change the fact that having evil orcs by default is inherently less dramatic than if they were their own factions with their own beliefs? Isn't that the better way to handle this? Plus, I only selected orcs to perform this exercise with. What if I pulled up Dark Elves, and I found out that Lolth was used as the justification from the very beginning? If that were the case, would that mean it's not an issue to treat Drow as a culture of creatures that can be slain with impunity and without any moral deliberation, because the lore would have remained internally consistent? I certainly don't think that's the case. But isn't that effectively the point I'm making when I use this tactic to debunk the argument? Maybe I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. When I covered this subject on TikTok a few years ago, before I had a YouTube channel, that's where I got a lot of these ideas across, somebody said, I feel differently from you. I make my orcs like Vikings. And I responded, you don't feel differently than I do because I also make my orcs like Vikings. I honestly think coding your orcs as Norse equivalents is a step in the right direction. I don't know if it solves all the problems, but I do know that we, as a culture, think of Vikings as a generally more nuanced people, at least compared to our versions of orcs. Sure, they're aggressive, but we'd be willing to watch a cartoon where they learn how to train dragons, or a show where they do all the stuff we know them for, but we get to know them as people. I assume that's what the show Vikings is about. I haven't seen it yet. I'm getting to it. And I honestly think the gods lend themselves well to those comparisons. Grumsh is a one-eyed war god. That personally makes me think of Odin. His son Bogtru is a muscle-bound meathead who fought some giant lizard-like monster. Give him a hammer, and he's just Thor, including the fight with the world serpent. And don't you kind of want to know what the orc version of a Valkyrie looks like? Yes, you do. Of course you do. That sounds incredible. So yeah, you can have Grumsh in your game, and have orcs who believe they will one day inherit the world, but they aren't all savagely raiding and killing everyone they encounter. That's totally doable. In real-world mythologies like Greek myths and in fictional worlds like Theros, there are gods who have tremendous beef with each other, yet we know their followers can coexist in the world. So it's possible for one party member to worship Grumsh and the other to worship Corellon, and for those two characters not to go to war over it. I'm going to be very curious how 1D&D handles that, because orcs are going to be an option for players. And so they will have to pull back on some of the ideas we've discussed in the past few videos, that all orcs are savage and evil, and that Grumsh commands them to be savage and evil. And as I said in the last video, it's fine to have an evil culture in your game, although it's a good idea to not have them be the only, or even the first example of those types of creatures in your game, but that's probably a subject for another time. That's a question of story structure, and we'll have to talk more about that at some point in the future. But the fact that this story of Grumsh feeling cheated out of his territory, almost like Hades in Greek myth, was introduced to help justify evil orcs in your games, and then slowly phased out because they felt they didn't need it anymore? That sucks. What we're left with, which has persisted across all the editions, is that Grumsh hates Corellon because Corellon shot out Grumsh's eye. And because we don't get any other motivation in most of these contexts, this is now meant to justify all orcs being evil by default. And that's just really lame. We've both gained and lost nuance across the decades, but the final product has a lot less nuance than it could. Wow, that really makes me think. It's actually really important how you share information with your players. It's not enough to just tell them something, like for example that not all orcs are evil. You need to demonstrate it in some way. And there's lots of ways that sharing your lore is a challenge. It can be really hard to get your players to understand what you're trying to say. Unless, of course, you use today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is an online resource that allows you to create articles for your world, which you can share with your players, which makes it easier than ever for your players to understand what you're trying to communicate. You can also run the game directly through the website, which honestly just makes everything so much easier. It's really nice to have your notes in the same resource as your digital table and digital dice rolling and character sheet functions, and no other service even comes close to that level of integration. Sign up for World Anvil using the code SUPERGEEK to save 40% off of any annual membership. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching. This concludes my trilogy of videos on alignment. I might come back to this subject at some other point. Like I said, I think there's advice on how to introduce different kinds of enemies, including enemies who belong to some of these factions and cultures, in a way that illustrates that these communities are still complex. And that will have to be a subject for some other time. If you want to support the channel, there are a few ways you can do that. You can subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos as soon as they come out, every Monday and Thursday. Although, you should keep your eyes peeled for some bonus Critical Role videos later this month. You can support me on Patreon. Any dollar amount really, genuinely helps the channel. You can join my Discord server to be a member of a cool community that just loves to share advice on RPGs and talk about actual play games. Plus, we've got an excellent memes channel. And you can sign up for my newsletter to get occasional updates about what I've got going on. Until next time, play fair and have fun.